This is Essay 35, Feminist Movement in USA and Canada. Women's activism grew rapidly in the 1960s in the USA because of persistent inequality, the activist tradition, economic pressures, Betty Friedan, and experience of the civil rights movement. After World War II, increasing numbers of women joined the paid workforce, although they were mostly waitresses, cleaners, shop assistants, or secretaries. College careers advisors steered educated women towards female occupations such as teaching or nursing, and nursing. In the mid-1960s, 80% of teachers, but only 10% of head teachers, 40% of university students, but only 10% of the faculty, 30% of the federal workforce, but only 2% of senior managers, 7% of doctors, and only 3% of lawyers, 50% of voters, but under 4% of state legislators, and 2% of judges. Gender equality was also prevalent in law or practice. 18 states refused to allow women to be jurors. Six states said that women could not enter into financial agreements without a male co-signing, and most schools expelled pregnant girls and fired pregnant teachers. These factors made middle-class women advocate for equal pay, equal work, equal opportunities, and equal respect. The 1960s women's movement did not just come out of the blue. The National Women's Party, which was established in 1916, was still active. Social feminists such as labor unionists were influential in the Democratic Party. Labor unionists helped persuade John F. Kennedy to establish a presidential commission on the status of women. This commission called for equal pay and also for special training of women for marriage and motherhood. It completely rejected feminist demands that an equal rights amendment to guarantee gender equality to be put into the Constitution. Twice as many women were employed in 1968 as well as 1940. Working women were more aware and more inclined to discuss gender inequality in the workplace. In pop culture and media of the 1950s, they all promoted the traditional domestic housewife norm. Sociologists point out how girls were trained to play with dolls and were later on felt under pressure to emphasize their femininity and hide their own intelligence. In her early 40s, Betty Friedan expressed women's sense of dissatisfaction with their traditional roles as the problem that had no name. She published a book in 1963 known as The Feminine Mystique that asserted the idea that women were imprisoned to domesticity. Friedan urged women to break out of this domesticity and live their lives to their full potential. Her book tapped into women's discontent and was a bestseller amongst female college students. A factor affecting women's rights was the influence of other rights movements. Women had been unsung heroes of the Black Civil Rights Movement. Important figures such as Ella Baker, Fannie Lou, Autherine Lucy, and Rosa Parks made large contributions along with the thousands who marched, mailed leaflets, boycotted, sat, rode, and were arrested as a part of the cause. Although women were tended to be ignored in favor of MLK, Malcolm X, or Huey Newton. I'm sorry, Mr. Bacall, I'm so tired. Powerful male figureheads took much of the credit and publicity, while the organizing and lower profile work fell to the women. Many of the female civil rights campaigners were very experienced and emboldened by the successes that they achieved, and were very angry about their treatment as women. The skills and experience of these women were very vital to the success of second wave feminism. Now, National Organization for Women. Okay. The government's Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, the EEOC, publicly refused to enforce the title. I don't know Roman numerals. I'm sorry. Of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which contained a ban on discrimination in employment on the basis of sex as well as race. This brought Betty Friedan, a pioneer to the labor movement, businesswomen, professional women, and participants in the civil rights organization formed the National Organization of Women. Now's tactics included litigation, political pressure, public information campaigns, and protests. In 1970, Now organized a national women's strike for equality. Thousands marched with the "Don't Iron While the Strike is Hot" banners. The movement of women who sought out equal rights became known as the Women's Liberation, or Women's Lib, and it quickly spread across campuses and cities. From 1967, women discussed discrimination and inequality in the consciousness of raising meetings in colleges, where women's studies, they eventually became a popular course in the community. The inherent biases in the English language have gone on to be a significant part of the feminist agenda. And this was for the discussion for Mrs. or Miss, but women began to use the prefix MS as a protest against the differentiation between Miss and Mrs., because why does it matter if a woman is married or not? Although only a quarter of women said that they felt discriminated against in a 1960s poll, however, the proportion raised to 2/3 by 1974 due to raised consciousness. By 1977, Now had nearly 70,000 members. They demanded a fully equal partnership of the sexes, child care assistance for mothers, women's reproductive rights, and particularly the Equal Rights Amendment, also known as the ERA. Although Now was also becoming the conservative part of the women's movement, and for some breakaway groups, Now was not radical enough. And in 1968, some began to use extreme tactics to gain media attention. A group called the Radical Women picketed the Miss America pageant in Atlantic City, New Jersey, and they claimed that the contest objectified women and they crowned a sheep as Miss America. Jackie Sabalos, who was at the protest, elaborately described her plan. We learned very early on that the press liked crazy things, so we used the press. On the fringes of that movement, more extreme forms of protest had also begun to emerge. Valerie Solanas, a radical feminist writer, had attempted to murder the artist Andy Warhol. During the 1970s, conservative opposition to feminist demands grew. Opponents of the Equal Rights Amendment said that it would lead to the end of the nuclear family. Although, despite the conservative opposition, politicians had finally started to take feminists seriously. President Johnson, from 1963 to 1969, responded to a feminist lobbying with an executive order that banned gender discrimination in federal connected employment. Women's groups monitored enforcement and now fought over 1,000 legal cases on the topic of discrimination. Others also began to pay attention to women's rights. Television commercials that women found demeaning were removed, and the EEOC, they took enforcement increasing seriously, and by 1971 now had brought in $30 million to, well, as reimbursement to women. Well, not necessarily reimbursement, but they raised $30 million for women. Yay! And most importantly, the Supreme Court, they finally seemed sympathetic to women's rights. The most famous court case that pertained to women's rights is Roe v. Wade, which occurred from 1970 to 1973. And in 1973, the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling in Roe v. Wade was recognized that the decision to whether to continue or end a pregnancy belongs to the rights of a woman, not the government. And Roe v. Wade had a profound effect on America's social landscape by reshaping American politics and dividing voters and politicians into two distinct groups, either pro-choice or pro-life. The 1970s has also brought a series of legal and social successes for second-wave feminists. Women's rights were finally being enshrined in law, and large amounts of legislation aimed at addressing women's rights were delivered. In 1968, President Johnson signed an executive order extending for the full affirmative action rights to women. In 1970, Title X was created and publicly funded family planning. In 1974, the Women's Educational Equity Act was passed, and in 1978, the Pregnancy Discrimination Act extended women's rights during pregnancy. Also in 1978, the legislation of no-fault divorce allowed many women to escape from their abusive marriages. And despite all of these legislative successes, it is still the change of social attitudes towards women are mostly considered the greatest success of the women's movement. The Equal Rights Amendment was a proposal to change the U.S. Constitution with an amendment that outlawed sex discrimination. It had a very long history. Almost every leading feminist since 1923 had some sort of involvement with it, but they had never been voted on or in either house, although they were introduced in every session from 1923 to 1970. The 1960s Congress was in favor of the ERA, and opinion polls suggested that 63% of the population agreed. However, the ERA became looked down upon in Congress, and it was finally defeated by 3 votes in 1982. By 3 votes, can you believe that? After 1975, the feminist movement had gone quite quiet. And in 1975, even Betty Friedan abandoned Now, and she criticized it as being anti-male, anti-family, and anti-feminine. However, the second wave feminism in the U.S. had still achieved many goals by 1980. It got a better deal for women in the workplace, at home, and in education. Furthermore, it has inspired women across the Americas and Europe. Some historians have argued that women's views were crucially transformed by second-wave feminism. As a result of second-wave feminism, changes to cultural norms, relationships, and even language made life for women considerably easier and more enjoyable for their grandmothers. More enjoyable than their grandmothers would have ever dreamed possible. However, other historians agree that the women's movement was one of the most influential social movements in modern U.S. history. However, they argue that we also overestimate the movement's success. Historian Nancy McLean considers the puzzle as to why the USA, which had, quote, the world's strongest women's movement, also had the largest gender wage gap. Feminism in Canada was slower in coming and more restrained than in the US. Although Canadian women had contributed extensively to the war effort, they were finally rewarded with the right to vote in 1919. Canada elected Agnes MacPhail as the first woman in Parliament in 1921. Despite these successes, Canadian feminism went quite quiet for the next 40 years. However, the rise of feminist movements in the U.S. prompted the Canadian government to create the Royal Commission on the Status of Women, which reported in 1970 that only 3.9% of managers were women, 2/3 of people on welfare were women, and although 8 out of 10 provinces did have equal pay laws, women were still paid less for men doing the same work. The Commission's report created an agenda for feminism in Canada for the next 2 decades. It created 167 recommendations, dealt with equality of employment, created training programs, increased representation for women in the Senate, gave them 18 weeks of maternity leave, access to birth control, and greater equality in pension rights. However, the Canadian government took too long to take board on these recommendations, and in protest, the National Action Committee was formed in 1972. The NAC helped by funding government grants and brought a great deal of media attention because they provided more help for women. The NAC's efforts helped to press the Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau in passing the Canadian Human Rights Act in 1977, which guaranteed no discrimination based on sex, race, religion, or sexuality. It also stated that there must be equal pay for work of equal value. However, in Canada, just like the US, in 1985 there was still a large disparity. Female employees were only earning 72% of the wages of their male counterparts. The formation of women's political pressure groups in both Canada and the USA helped put pressure on their respective governments. The creation of the Committee for the Equality of Women in Canada in 1966 was mirrored by the establishment of the National Organization for Women in the USA, which was also founded in 1966. Both of these groups lobbied politicians and brought media attention to the disparities in income and opportunity for women. In Canada, the government felt compelled to set up the Royal Commission on the Status of Women. The Commission's report was published several years later and took very long to be put into place. And in the case of the U.S., now pushed for the enforcement of ignored legislation and brought great pressure to bear on politicians through marches, petitions, demonstrations, and etc. Canada's results were very slow coming. However, in both countries, politicians were served notice that they can no longer take women's votes for granted. In conclusion, feminist movements had a significant political and social impact on both the USA and Canada. While both neighboring countries had shared similar results in the fight for women's rights, as well as backlash and media commentary, they still had their differences. In Canada, women were guaranteed political rights, but U.S. women were not, especially with the failure of the Equal Rights Amendment.